Okay. And then with the Bodhichitta, with that Bodhichitta motivation, you can do the verse of Refuge and Bodhichitta that we often begin with. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So I was thinking maybe I'll just mention some, before we return, like kind of return to where we left off in the text. I was thinking just to mention something briefly to kind of think about as we cover this school and then the other, we're on the Vaibhashika, right? The first of the four tenet systems. But I just thought to sort of mention like almost, just something to think about, which will come up again and again. And when I was thinking about it this way, that, after the Buddha achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, right? He famously hesitated to teach, right? He said this doctrine, this truth I've realized is very profound. And he waited for like 49, difficult. Maybe nobody will understand it essentially, right? And he waited for like 49 days to teach. And they say then Brahma came and kind of offered him the Dharma wheel and said, you vowed to teach and so on. But his point was, right, he said this is difficult and profound and maybe people won't understand. And part of what he was getting at there, according to tradition, is, right, that if you think about it this way, like, that Buddha taught, say, that the nature of samsara is suffering. That in ancient Indian culture wasn't difficult. Many people thought that, right? Like the Jains thought that, there were many, he had joined a kind of other ascetics, right, who left home to seek nirvana. So the idea that, nirvana was worth seeking and that samsara was the nature of suffering, that was profound, but it wasn't extremely difficult to understand, right? And it wasn't unique, right? And oftentimes Buddhist teachers point out one thing that's totally unique to Buddhism, that only the Buddha taught, was selflessness, right, and emptiness. And first of all, that's difficult, right? What is the meaning of selflessness or emptiness? And then also, and this is what all these schools have to contend with, and they contend with this question, each one in a different way, is if the person is selfless, what exists? Right? Because everybody agrees the Buddha was not teaching nihilism. There were other nihilist schools in ancient India, and he was not a nihilist, and he was clear about that. Right, so it's this question, if, and actually anybody who gets interested seriously in Buddhism at some point, or many times, hopefully, asks those questions, right? In other words, if in some sense the self doesn't exist, and if grasping at a self of at least persons, or in Mahayana schools, persons and self of phenomena, like, in other words, if grasping at a self is the cause of samsara, of suffering, and if the self in some sense doesn't exist, then how do I exist, right? How do I function? How does karma function? How do objects function, right? And how is it that things exist but at least persons lack a self? How is it that you exist if you lack a self, right? And these are, right, so when the Buddha said, this will be difficult to understand, I think he was, Buddhist, I don't just me, but Buddhist teachers often say, right, that's the core of what's difficult. And so if you really think about it, I want to, somewhat like a framework to come back to over and over, this point, right, is, so how do each of these different tenet systems or Buddhist schools of thought answer that question, right? What does selflessness mean? And what exists? How do things exist if they're selfless? If the person is selfless, at least, again. And oftentimes if you go to enough, well, some of you, many of you have done this, right? If you go to enough classes on Buddhism, right? Like with lamas or something, eventually, right, somebody will say, well, if there's no self, what reincarnates, right? Well, how does, or, things like that. Well, each of these schools are raising those kinds of questions, if that makes sense, right? And they're each kind of answering those questions at different levels of subtlety. So that's one point I wanted to make. And then maybe I'll just go on and make another point, which is also these Buddhist schools, one is they address those questions in different ways. And I just want to suggest thinking about it as we go along, right? Sort of, wow, how do they answer that question? And then I want to suggest, I'm going to share my own, and maybe now I'm just sharing my own experience for a moment, which is my own experience as I study these four schools. One is, many experiences, but one is like a sense of wonder. In this first school, right, the Vaibhashika school, right, they're going to say that part of what exists is, I already said it once, but we're going to cover it more, but are, directionally partless particles, right, is one of the things that is an ultimate truth according to them, right? And I want to suggest that, this, remember, the Buddha taught, actually, I was thinking about this, I actually looked it up. I was like, well, that's atoms, right? They translate that as atoms, right? And translators usually say it, it's directionally partless particles. And this is the Buddhist teaching from the Buddha, right? But so 400 years later, actually, and this is bothering me, actually, I'll just share it. It's kind of bugging me, actually. 400 years after the Buddha, right, in Greece, I think it was Democritus, came up with the theory of atoms. And he invented the word atom in ancient Greek. And they say, well, so the Greeks invented the idea of atoms, right? Actually, it existed long before them, right? At least a century earlier in India. And remember, what's remarkable is, this is the grossest of the four schools, right? In other words, when you get to Majjhimaka, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama often points out, Majjhimaka thinkers can talk with particle physicists, right, with modern physicists, and have a meaningful dialogue back and forth, right? So it's quite remarkable, right, that these subtle presentations of the nature of reality, first of all, they're still remarkable, and that they were sort of presented so long ago is remarkable, in my view. Just sharing my own experience of that. Because it's easy to say, oh, well, there can't be we could say there's not a directionally partless particle, right? But one is quite a subtle theory. The other is wow, that was presented, 2,500 years ago. So anyway, it's a remarkable tradition. That's all. Just I was thinking about that, so I wanted to share it. But anyway, we'll get into now we'll go back to the Vaibhashikas and go into more detail. And we covered the etymology, and we left off, there are 7 points under each school. So in the text, we're up to the 4th point, which we started. So the 4th point, and this is getting at what I was just talking about, right? So they talk about the ways. 4th point is the way of asserting objects. And remember, I've said this before, that these 7 points are going to be covered for each school, right? But now we're on the Vaibhashika, the first, the Great Exposition Vaibhashika school. Or proponents of particulars, right? Or particularists, one translator said. Actually, I'm just going to say, I'm going off on this short tangents. I'll just do one more tangent. This school's amazing, actually. I just want to say that too. I was thinking about this, of course, there's an emphasis on Majjhimaka, actually, but this school, this school, right, comes from, in Tibetan tradition, it derives, its sort of main focus would be the Abhidharma Kosha, right? And the Abhidharma is amazing, actually, right? Like it's one of my, I've studied the Abhidharma just a little, but I wish I got to study it more. Like it's an amazing system, right? That's what talks about perception. The Abhidharma tradition, right, talks about mind and mental factors in great detail, about perception and how perception works. It has amazing tradition of well, Bob Thurman calls it the Buddhist inner sciences, right? But it actually talks about cosmology. It talks about perception. It talks about mind and mental factors and so on. So it's an amazing tradition. So this tradition is amazing. And one thing is because, like if you read Madhyamaka, of course, it's mainly discussing emptiness, right? Whereas this school goes into humongous detail about the particulars. That's why I've thought of it, we said the particularists, right? This school goes into humongous detail about the specifics of conventional reality, right? And, mind and matter and so on. So this school is incredibly useful to study, in terms of understanding those things, which, if you look for those details in, say, the writings of Nagarjuna, he doesn't dwell on those things much. So studying this tradition and the Abhidharma is remarkable. But anyway, in this text, which is our text by Jetsun Chogi Gelsen, he covers it's a brief overview. But so we covered this part last time. So under the way of asserting objects, he says the definition of thing is that which is able to perform a function. And I kind of talked about that last time. That's a unique tenet of this school, because other schools say there are things that don't perform a function, but Vaibhashikas say all things perform a function. And then I said this, right? They say thing, existent, and object of knowledge are equivalent. And that last point I think is important throughout Buddhism, is that actually I just think that's an important point to remember for all these schools, that all Buddhist schools actually agree on that point, that which exists is an object of knowledge. That's interesting, isn't it? Like because I'm not sure that I'm not sure all traditions would agree on that, but Buddhist traditions say that which if something is existent, it means it's an object of knowledge or it's knowable, right? If something, so there is, from a Buddhist perspective, something that cannot be known is not an object of knowledge, right? And that which is not and therefore is not an existent. So if it exists, that means it can be known. Doesn't mean everybody knows it, of course, but it can be known. And then Jetsun Chogi Gelsen starts to categorize, and he starts with this. He says there are two types of things: permanent things and impermanent things. And again, all Buddhist schools teach those two categories. They describe them sometimes slightly differently, but they all share those categories. Right, so sometimes actually, I'll just point this out, sometimes we say, and actually a few things that are worth noting here. One is, in Buddhism, I always think it's tricky in English, actually, this part, like, and people sometimes get confused. In Buddhism, impermanent means it doesn't last a second, that it doesn't last unchanged for a second moment, right? That in each moment, that object is changing, right? And that's, because sometimes, like in English, the word, if we say something is impermanent, actually it's interesting, isn't it? Well, this is a delusion, isn't it? We sometimes think that way, right? If you say like if I say the George Washington Bridge is impermanent, actually what comes to mind initially, because it's this huge, right, if you've driven across the George Washington Bridge, right, humongous metal, asphalt and all that, and you get this image of something that's seems unchanging, but if you think of it, like if I don't think of it from a Buddhist perspective, I think, well, it's sort of there and it's not changing. Every time I go, it's the George Washington Bridge, but someday it'll fall apart. I can accept that, right? It won't last forever. But what Buddhism is saying is something more subtle than that, right? That's not what Buddhism's saying, right? But I do have that image, right? I have this image, like, well, if I think of the Key Bridge, going into DC, it's smaller, much smaller, right? But it seems like, well, the Key Bridge is always there, But, you know, of course, someday it'll fall apart. Right? Nothing lasts forever. And I probably won't be here, but, you know, if I try to imagine, like, you know, actually, if I would say, well, someday the earth will be burnt up and when the sun goes, you know, sun expands. So of course the key bridge won't last forever. I can accept that, right? But it seems like each time I go, it's the same. Right? Buddhism is saying, no, that's not true. Right? Impermanent means changing instant by instant. And an implication of that is that someday, you know, what does it say? Everything that comes together, you know, all things that come together due to cause and conditions will someday cease. But they'll cease because they're changing every instant. Does that make sense? And we know that's true, actually. It is true. So when we say there are permanent things and impermanent things, what impermanent means is changing instant by instant. And then also, you know, in Buddhism, sometimes we say all things are impermanent. That's not literally true, of course. All compounded things are impermanent. That's a true statement, right? But it's not literally true that all things are changing instant by instant. And as you'll see, some of these, this is an important, funny point, at least one category of permanent things don't last forever. Does that make sense? When I go over them, you'll see what I mean. So permanent also, it doesn't mean it will last forever. It means it's not changing instant by instant. Okay, and then Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen continues, and he says, he gives three examples, and these are the three that are traditionally given by the Vaibhashika school. So he gives three examples of permanent things. He says, examples of permanent things are uncompounded space, analytic cessations, and non-analytic cessations. So, let's go through each of those briefly, right? So uncompounded space, in general, that's defined, like in general in Buddhism, space is defined as, right, that which is free from obstruction. Actually, one Abhidharma text I was looking at said, and is either, which I thought was an interesting point, just to think about. They were saying unobstructed and they said and can be in the nature of light or dark, light or darkness. Was one text. That's not in this text, but that one text said that. That was a Vaibhashika text, right? With some recognition that there are areas of space that are not pervaded by light and that are pervaded by light. But anyway, so uncompounded space is is unobstructedness. Right, and part of what they're getting at there is that space, in that sense, let's see if I say this right. Is not compounded, so it's not. It didn't arise due to what's the word? Causes and conditions that gave rise to it the way a sprout does, right? It's just it's a quality of unobstructedness. Then analytic cessations. What those are when a being has gained, so the analytic means a being has gained, through analysis, has realized selflessness, according to this school, right? Selflessness of person. And through the power of their meditation on that selflessness of persons, they've succeeded in causing the cessation, meaning that they've eliminated the cause for certain mental afflictions. And therefore, so mental afflictions arise due to grasping at a self. And then there comes a point where, due to having realized selflessness, one eliminates the cause for giving rise to a certain mental affliction through the process of your own meditation, right? That's your analysis and meditation. And from that point forward, that mental affliction will no longer arise, right? And so there are various points along the path where, due to the person's realizing selflessness, they no longer will get angry, for example. they no longer will give rise to pride. They no longer will give rise to doubt. Eventually, they no longer will give rise to desire. And so, and that's a part of the process of becoming liberated from samsara, of achieving liberation or moksha. So an analytic cessation is, again, so due to the power of analyzing and understanding or realizing selflessness of persons in this school, there is a cessation of mental affliction, right? And so really what that is right, is due to the lack of a cause of those such mental afflictions, then they will not arise in the future. That's an analytic cessation. And then a non-analytic cessation is, the cessation in this sense is not, what's the word? It doesn't mean forever. It means due to lacking the causes of a certain thing, that thing doesn't arise for a certain time. And so, like, you could say, for example, due to the fact that your current rebirth is as a human being, there's a cessation of you being an elephant, right? In other words, the causes don't exist for you to be an elephant at this time, so you're not an elephant, and you won't be an elephant at this time, in this lifetime. So, but also like a due to a lack of the causes, right? So, that could also include, like, so for example, at the bottom of the ocean, there's no wheat growing, right? The causes are not there for wheat to grow at the bottom of the ocean, so wheat doesn't grow at the bottom of the ocean, right? Now if, the planet's tectonic plates change and that ocean floor, as happens, eventually is a plain, above land somewhere, and there's soil on it, and there's, then actually won't be the bottom of the ocean anymore, but that's saying, that some of that earth could eventually have wheat growing on it. So it's not like some kind of, that was what I was getting at earlier. In this sense, permanent means that state of non-wheat growing is not changing instant by instant, right? It doesn't mean it will last forever. And then, especially in the non-analytic cessations, those don't. Analytic cessations, once you achieve a cessation of a certain mental affliction, it will never arise again. But with the non-analytic cessations, it means, like, so the example I gave earlier, right? The fact that, like, if I'm currently a human, so during this life, there's a cessation of my being an elephant, that doesn't mean I can't take rebirth as an elephant again, right? Doesn't mean it's impossible. But it's permanent in the sense that status of non-elephantness is not changing instant by instant. It's just a truth that's true for the whole of this lifetime. And the lack of wheat growing at the bottom of the ocean is a truth that's not changing instant by instant. So that's what permanent means in that sense. And I was going to say one other thing about that. Yeah, and that's different than, say, that's different than impermanent things, which is what we get to next. So maybe I'll cover the impermanent things. That'll help understand the permanent things, and then I'll pause if you have questions. So then he says, Justin Choi Gelton says, examples of impermanent things are created phenomena, products, and impermanent phenomena. Examples of those would be like a cup, telephone, a bridge, a house, right? And so when he says here, how does he say it? Product, right? Well, let's use the example of a house, right? So a house is a product, right? It was produced due to causes and conditions. It has parts. Those parts were brought together, right? So it was a produced phenomena, produced from by causes and conditions, and again, and so think about it. So so a house, right, is an example of an impermanent product, an impermanent created phenomena. And a house changes instant by instant, right? In every instant, a house, is changing. it's aging, right? Each second, each half a second, it's aging. Each millisecond, whatever, it's aging. Our own body is, and our body is also, right, a impermanent phenomena. It's a product, right, a created phenomena that arose due to causes and conditions, and that each instant is aging, is changing. Right? So I want to pause there and ask, does that make so? That's one. That ends. He's going to continue on with their way of asserting objects, but that was the first categorization. In other words, one way of categorizing phenomena is you can categorize them into permanent things and impermanent things. Any questions about that categorization before I go on to the next? Sujata.
I'd like to know a little bit about this example. Thank you, Lauren. This is all already wonderfully helpful. I'd like to know more about the example of the permanent state of not being an elephant. I think my mind immediately goes to, well, what if I'm creating the causes and conditions to become an elephant in my next lifetime? And am I not sort of changing in a sense towards that in this lifetime? I don't know. I'm sorry, my mind is getting a little messed up in that.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. Yeah, like I guess according to this, I mean, if you think about this one, it doesn't, in terms of the non-analytic cessations, which is what you're asking about, it doesn't mean that the causes don't exist, actually, right? It just means that that's, according to this school, it just means that status doesn't exist. Like, so, and you can imagine that, right? Like, so for example, if you think of a time when a certain area, I gave this other example, right? A time when there was a certain area under the ocean, and so therefore no wheat would grow. And we could think of examples on the planet, right? Where now those same, we would say those same regions are now a plain with, an area of, that where you can grow wheat. But so it wasn't that it was an impossibility or that the potential for that didn't exist. It was just during that time there was something blocking, in a sense, that there were certain conditions where that could not arise. And so right now, like in the case of like the elephant, for example, it would be that because your rebirth, your karma to be human has ripened, as long as that lasts, that obstructs, even if you have karma to be an elephant, for example, the fact that your mental continuum is currently incarnated as a human would be an obstructive condition, and therefore it cannot arise during this life. That you cannot take rebirth as an elephant while you're still a human. So it's that there's an obstructive condition, and therefore that can, so these are not eternal, but while that obstructive condition lasts, it's a status of sort of where something else is not happening and cannot happen. But yes, so even if one did create the causes, they can't, like the idea would be there's an obstructive condition, so they cannot ripen during this life. Yeah, it's interesting. That's why it's important to understand this thing about not changing instant by instant, and that's not eternal. We often, I've so many times I've heard when lamas teach about, and the translator use the word impermanent, people take that to mean eternal. And in Buddhism, some permanent phenomena are eternal, but others are not. So the definition of, that's why it's important that the definition of permanent is, in this case, it would be an existent phenomena which is not changing instant by instant. Right? But it doesn't imply an eternal phenomena. And that's confusing too, because there are some permanent phenomena which are eternal. Right? Like an example of that would be, the analytic cessation in the continuum of an arhat. Right? Those are eternal, in the sense that if somebody's an arhat, those mental afflictions will never arise again. So those are permanent phenomena, but they're also eternal in the sense that because the causes of those have been permanently eliminated, they'll never arise again. Cynthia.
So for the permanent non-analytical cessation. So for the grosser aspects, can I say that anything lacking something is permanent? That the absence of, like a cup, the absence of the cup being uh, a glass would um just because looking at it as the right even space. So, and also what, because it says here uncompounded space, what is compounded space? Does that
Okay,
mean that like there's elements there and therefore it's not permanent? Thank you.
no, those are two good questions. I like those questions. Those are interesting questions. I'll answer the second question first. Like, one thing is like uncompounded space is like the mere lack of obstructiveness, whereas they would say compounded space is like, so if you said like the space inside of my mouth, that would be compounded, and it's like sort of created. So you would say that's, my mouth is moving, and so it's dependent upon, in any given instant, it's dependent upon matter, or the space inside of a cup or something like that. If you lift up the cup, it has space in it. So compounded space would be this, the space inside of a physical object, whereas uncompounded space is sort of the non-obstructedness in which things arise, or don't arise, as the case may be. So that's that part. But then your other question is I think also, I've thought about that. In other words, I've not seen a text that answers that question, but I thought about that question too, because I was like, well, isn't, and I've thought the same thing, isn't the lack of anything in a way a permanent phenomenon? So if I were to say, like using what you said, right, I sometimes thought about it, like, let's say, is the lack of a space shuttle inside my house a permanent phenomena according to the school? And I would, I mean, I've not, first of all, no Buddhist text ever asked about space shuttles inside your house, but I would, my personal position would be yes, that would be a permanent phenomena, right? Like, in other words, in the sense that that's not changing instant by instant, or the lack of, the lack of a piece of metal being plastic. If you think of that conceptually, it's knowable. In other words, because if you think about it this way, right, is the fact that a piece of metal is not plastic is knowable, right? So it exists in that sense, but it's not impermanent. So it has. So my own position would be that has to be permanent. I've not asked a Lama that, but if you think about the meaning of it, then I thought that has to be that, isn't it? So at least that's my own view on that.
I'd like to add something to that. Could the image that you're conjuring, it's a conception, so it's therefore permanent? Is that a correct way to look at that, or a possibility, or?
That's it. So you're saying, like, say it again, like, say that again, just to make sure I'm clear.
You came up with this concept, and as I understand it, by definition, images don't change, so they're classified as permanent, correct?
Yeah, that was one thing I said this once, like, that it's interesting question in the sense that is true. Like they say a generic image is a permanent in the sense that it's not changing instant by instant. And that is emphasized in the next school up. That's a teaching that is actually emphasized in the Sautantrika school.
Right.
But it's an interesting question. Would that same, I think you're asking an interesting question, Paul, which is like, if you assert that right, like a mental image, as well, let's actually consider it here, right? So in other words, a mental image, is it an object of knowledge, right? And is it, I guess, and then you have to ask, according to this school, that's an interesting question. Would that be, in this school, would that be permanent or impermanent? because that's definitely considered impermanent in the Sautantrika school. I mean, that's considered permanent, as you pointed out, in the Sautantrika school. But what would the kind of, I think what you're asking in a sense and by implication is, so what would the Vaibhashika school say about those? Is that kind of what you're asking?
I'm not sure. But yeah, I think that's close. How would they then, I mean, I hadn't really thought of it in terms of the Vaibhashika school, so that's an interesting question.
Well, actually,
also.
I think, Paul, you're right, though. It's connected to what Cynthia was saying. So I'll just make a point, which is part of the way the Sautantrika school talks about that is in terms of negation or elimination. So it is the same question. I think you're raising something very similar to what Cynthia was raising, but now it's a mental thing instead of a physical that we're talking about. But because part of the way the Sautantrika school talks about, when they talk about, say, what's the word? Labels, mental image, like a generic image. They talk about a mental generic image of a horse. And they would say part of that is that it's created through the process of elimination, in the sense that a horse is not a cow. It's not a cow, it's not a person, it's not a table. It has 4 legs, but it's not a table. It's alive, but it's not a person. People have 2 legs and so on. And eventually you come to the image of a horse. And so they would say part of the reason it's permanent is that it's not changing instant by instant, but part of it is because it's also created through a process of elimination. So in that sense, I think, it seems like you could assert that that's that in this school, according to the non-analytic cessations, but I've not heard a lama, discuss that, but that makes sense to me. Either one, I guess Jeff and Lynn both have their hands raised, so either person, I guess.
What is light in uncompounded space?
That actually, is an interesting question. Let's see if I can find it. That was kind of an odd sort of thing I added, but whoops. I'll actually just find the quote because there it is, unconditioned phenomena. Actually, he doesn't really define it. So I'm not sure how I don't know. I only saw it in one place, actually, where they sort of mentioned that, but they don't define it. So it's not really clear to me, to be honest, what they meant by that. I mean, I could make up my own sort of theory, but I shouldn't do that. So I don't really know. Yeah, it's not clear.
What is light?
That's an interesting question. That's actually interesting, isn't it? I mean, from this school's perspective, right? This school really talks about this. This school, this is the school where, as we've talked about in the Heart Suture classes a little bit, this school talks about the sense spheres, right? So from this school's perspective, what they would emphasize is that light is the is the object of visual consciousness, right? And of the visual sense power. Just as sound would be the object of the auditory consciousness and sense power, right? So they would talk about it in that way, relationally, wouldn't they? Because they talk about that each of the senses has its consciousness, the sense power, and the object. So that's how this school talks about it in terms of the sense spheres.
So the lightness in uncompounded space is irrelevant.
As far as I know, it's not something I probably shouldn't have mentioned because I don't even know what they meant by that, to be honest. But Yeah, I mean, because the main definition of uncompounded space here is, I'll actually read it. Not about the light, because it doesn't really give anything about that, but it says, space is defined as that which does not obstruct, since it accommodates form. It is separate both from that which is obstructed and the obstructor. Space is that which is free from obstructive resistance and accommodates physical objects. So that's how they define space.
So light is not form.
That's interesting, because yeah, you would think in this school actually that light would be form. So I suppose in that sense, actually, that, I think, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I think that in this school, yeah, light would be a visual object, so it would be particles, right, from this school's perspective. You'd be seeing something, or you'd be seeing whatever that object is. So I think from this school's perspective, light would be form.
And therefore irrelevant to the uncompoundedness of space.
Yeah, it would just be like, yeah, I think so, wouldn't it? It would be the same as if you said, wouldn't it? It would be the same as if you said like a tree appeared in space or something. It's like, it's that space is unobstructed, so things can, so physical objects can arise within it.
Yeah, it's just strange that he pointed out,
Yeah,
that was pointed out as two distinct
statuses.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't really know why they did, actually, to be honest. So,
Thank you.
yeah, I agree with you. I think it's object. It's a physical. It's form. I mean, sorry, Lynn had a question too, or comment.
When Paul was talking about you have an image in your mind, I would think that that's not permanent, because a permanent thing is analytical cessation. So I don't think the image, I mean, according to these definitions, I don't think that image would exist because it's an analytical image. It's analytical. It's putting a label on something. And this is the cessation of analysis or analytical.
Oh, I see. Well, I want to clarify. So, like, maybe I didn't say it clear. So, like, the analytical cessations actually, what that's specifically, that's very specific. That's not talking about mental images, that one. In other words, the analytical cessations is talking about, like, really those exist in the mind of people who have seen selflessness, the selflessness of a person, and in meditation, and have achieved through the power of having realized selflessness, they've been able to undermine the cause of a certain mental affliction. And so therefore that mental affliction won't arise again, and doesn't arise for them. And so the cessation is of the mental affliction in that sense. Like, so there is that through their power of having meditated on selflessness, like, let's say, I'll give an example. Like, let's say an example could be like let's say a hearer, like a person who's striving for their own liberation, realizes selflessness, and they reach a point where they'll no longer give rise to pride, because they've realized that the self, there is no substantially existent, what's it called? Substantially existent self, like, and through the power of that, they've realized it so thoroughly that they can no longer give rise to the experience of pride. That would be a cessation, the cessation of pride. There is that the cause of pride no longer exists, because pride can only exist based on a kind of grasping at my self-image, and that person no longer has that level of grasping at a self-image, so they can't give rise to kind of pride or arrogance. And that state of like having ceased pride or arrogance is an analytical cessation. So that's what an analytical cessation is in that sense, is that a certain mental affliction has stopped through the power of that person having previously analyzed.
But it almost, I mean, maybe I'm confused, but it almost seems like analytical cessations are, I mean, the way I understood it is that's like a step toward realizing emptiness. In other words, so it
Oh,
just
no, it
seems
comes
like,
after. Actually, it comes after having realized. Like, in other words, it's not a step toward, like, in other words, it's actually, analytic cessation happens after somebody has realized. Like, a person has to have already realized selflessness.
okay, how do I want to say this? It's like a condition of realizing emptiness, that you realize emptiness and you know, and you have a cessation of analytical and analysis.
The step on the path to enlightenment.
Yep.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
So, but that has to do with all analysis, not just the cessation of selflessness. It was my understanding. That's why I sort of look at that and say, oh, that's after realizing emptiness, you no longer, you have analytical cessations. That's the way I sort of thought that existed.
Yeah, so it is after having analyzed and realized selflessness. But yeah, so analytic cessations though are not connected to other analysis. Like, so in other words, if I were analyzing like my taxes, that's not related to an analytic cessation or something. Like, in other words, that's a kind of analysis, right? Do I owe taxes or something? But that would have nothing to do with analytic cessation. Analytic cessation is only where the person is analyzing selflessness, and then through the power of having realized that, they mental affliction cease. So it's not about other kinds of analysis, if that makes sense. Does that make sense though, or no? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it just narrows what I understood that to mean.
Yeah, so then that's right though. Analytic cessations are kind of narrow just to those processes. They're only about analysis. The analysis was only of selflessness in that sense, not of other things, in that particular kind of cessation. And so those cessations, yeah, only happen on the path to liberation, or enlightenment.
So is this a condition to realizing emptiness, or is it the same thing as realizing emptiness?
That's interesting, because like one point I'll say is like, well, actually, I'm sort of pausing because like this school, right? I'm sort of being careful because we're doing tenets. So this school, the Vaibhashika school, speaks more of selflessness than emptiness. In other words, they will use the word emptiness occasionally, but when they use the word emptiness, they mean selflessness of persons. So they don't mean it. So one thing I'm sort of hesitating about, I'm trying to be careful to follow this school since we're doing tenets, is the Vaibhashika school doesn't speak of emptiness in the way that Mahayana schools do. Whereas if they use the word emptiness, they mean that, because remember on the previous page, actually, it said, how should you say this? Yeah, this school doesn't refute, well, it actually doesn't say it here, it says it somewhere else, but this school doesn't teach an emptiness of phenomena. So they only teach an emptiness of self, of persons. So that's one thing. I'm just trying to be careful in the use of, just to make clear, so because it's easy to get confused, I know. So when they say, they will use the word emptiness occasionally, but what they mean by emptiness is selflessness of persons. But I don't know if that's not what you were asking. So just to clarify, I just want to clarify that, because I think otherwise it could get confusing more or something. But I don't think that fully answers your question. So I just wanted to, that's a clarification of terms, but then say more about your question.
Well, if you narrow analytical, it seems like you narrow, for me, okay? It just like narrows the experience of negating selflessness, or negating the cessation of selflessness, or yes, maybe that's what I'm saying. It just seems much narrower than emptiness.
And it is, yeah. You're right, it is narrower. That's true. Because you're used to like the Majjhima. I think part of what you're saying is, you know, which is going to be true for many of us, I think, as we go along, and especially in these two, well, actually in all the schools in a way, is that if we've mainly studied Madhyamaka, you know, like the Heart Sutra, right, says, I said that another time, right? The Heart Sutra says this line, right? The five aggregates also are empty of inherent existence, right? So if you study Madhyamaka, there's a sense of everything is empty, right? All phenomena are empty. Everything lacks substantial existence. Whereas this school doesn't say that, right? They just say, they say no. Like they would say, no, of course, like form is not empty. Feeling is not empty. They wouldn't say that. Or is they? So you're right. It is much narrower. They would say, but is there? You know, if you ask this school, is there a unitary, permanent, independent self? They would say no. That doesn't exist. You know, so they are much narrower in what they refute. So I think you're right about that. I think you're getting at something important, which is that this school is more narrow in what they refute than the Madhyamakas.
It's just analytically, I don't know. It's just hard to conceptualize or pull back from what we're used to thinking about.
Mm-hmm. And that's right. Yeah. Now you're getting it. Like, I think that's a good sign. That's what this school, that's what we're getting at though. I think it's a great question in a sense that that's like, you're getting it. That's what this school is doing is, and part of why this school does that, I think, this is my own opinion, is from this, well, actually, it's not just my opinion. Actually, they would say that from this school's perspective, if you were to do what Madhyamakas do, if a Madhyamaka came along to a Vaibhashika person, that Vaibhashika would say, you're a nihilist. What do you mean there's no form? That's nihilistic. Of course there's form. You know, actually this school would say, you know, if I slap you in the face, it's going to hurt you. There's form. Right? Like, what are you talking about? Right? So this school would say, you know, and they would say, you're being nihilistic if you think there's no form. You're denying something that obviously exists. I see form. I feel it. It does exist. You know, and if you say it doesn't, if you say no, you know, it's empty, then you're denying something that's true, and therefore you're being nihilistic. So you're right. In other words, this school is much narrower, and part of that is that this school is trying to help people not become nihilistic. And you could see how actually this school in some ways, also I think what you said implies something actually, which is part of the value of this school, is, I mean, think about the world, right? There are a lot of people actually, like, you know, in other words, you know, people who can study Madhyamaka and hold to ethics and compassion have to be very intelligent actually, right? And there are a lot of people where if you said everything is empty, they would say, well, then I can do whatever I want. Who cares? You know, nothing's real, so I'll go do whatever, you know. And this school is saying, no, wait a second. You know, there's not a unitary, permanent, substantially existent you, but things do exist, and therefore you'll suffer, you know, and be careful. You know, and it sort of gives something concrete, so to allow the person to be, what's the word, ethically careful about in a way. So they think there's a huge value in this school, if that makes sense, especially for somebody who otherwise would actually fall into nihilism. And so this school makes it easier in a way. This school's presentation, which we're about to get to, of the conventional and the ultimate, is a much easier than the Madhyamakas in terms of how do you posit a harmony of the two truths and avoid nihilism while still denying a substantially existent self.
Historically, was this something of a reaction to nihilism? I mean, was that a big deal in those days? I mean, just historically?
That's an interesting question. Like, you know, I mean, at the Buddha's time, the impression you get is that there were many, many different philosophies already existent. And I mean, I don't think that nihilism was the most common. I think it's much more common now than it was then, you know, according to my own reading. There are many, many, many more nihilists now than there were at the time of the Buddha. But there were nihilists at his time, for sure. You know, people who he would have considered to be a nihilist. But actually, there are way more nihilists now, actually, really. Like, I think part of I personally often think this, that part of our problem in society is that we have humongous numbers of nihilists, actually, who therefore don't, you know, aren't committed to ethics, aren't committed to care, actually. But there were nihilists at that time too, and the Buddha and Nagarjuna often warns against the dangers of nihilism. So, you know, he's after the Buddha, but I mean, so there were certainly traditions of nihilism, but they were never as prominent as they are, I think, in our time. Yeah, because according to Buddhism, like, nihilism is considered evil, really, like an evil doctrine, because it undermines kindness, ethics, decency, care. Yeah, it's horrifying. Actually, I'm just pausing. It's like, it's actually horrifying if you think about it, right? Like, you know, there are all these behaviors we see in people, but according to Buddhism, everything's led by the mind, right? And if you actually trace it back, right, many of the people who do things that are causing so much suffering, it's grounded actually in nihilism, really. It's just horrifying, actually. But is there, yeah, any more about this permanent and, or more about, Lynn, do you have more question, or is that clear? Okay. Anything else about the permanent and impermanent?
Hey, Lauren, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if maybe we got into this question earlier, but maybe we went into something else and we kind of didn't address it or something. But when we were talking about, you know, the text is saying, you know, examples of impermanent things, and it mentions created phenomena, and then it mentions impermanent phenomena. So why are those two kind of, it seemed like they're basically like separate things, but to me it seemed like they're synonymous. Did you go into that, or did you not address that? Or I'm sorry if you did and I missed it, but it was basically, so what is the difference here between when we're talking about impermanent phenomena, the difference between created phenomena and impermanent phenomena? Is that not like the same thing? Like,
Yeah, you're right. According to this school, like, those would be synonyms. You're exactly right. Like, so in other words, and it's just like different words for the same thing. Like, so, you know, in other words, when you say the word impermanent, you're implying, you know, that it changes instant by instant. When you're saying it's created, you're implying it was created by causes and conditions. but they mean the same. Like, so it's just a difference. Like, it's different words to sort of emphasize a different aspect of that thing. But you're right, they're synonyms. In other words, all phenomena every phenomena that's a created phenomena is also an impermanent phenomena. Like, so they're like, what's the word? They like completely overlap. You know, they're the same phenomena. So it's just different terms that emphasize like a different aspect of that phenomena, but it's the same.
Oh, so it's not saying they're different then.
No,
Okay.
no,
All
and
right,
I
thanks.
didn't say that clearly actually, but no, that's right. So like you could say they're synonyms, or they refer to exactly the same phenomena, but they're just referring to them in different words to emphasize different aspect or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, anything else about that?
Yeah, Lauren, I have a question. How is an analytic cessation or selflessness of persons a functioning thing? How does it function?
That's an interesting question too, isn't it? Because like, according to let's say it right, like I believe all the other tenet systems would say those are not functioning. You know, those are not. They wouldn't call them that. And they even say that about so for example, like about all three of those, right? Like, because this school is unique. That's a unique tenet of this school, that all things, right? On the previous page, it says that the definition of a thing is that which is able to perform a function, right? So, so I'll say one thing, which is, you know, since as somebody who mainly follows the other schools, that unique tenet is a little confusing, isn't it? It's a difficult one. You know, and I'm trying to think what the one Geshe and one commentary said, like, that he used the example of space on this point, and he was saying he was making this point that it's unique, right? It's like a unique, that other schools would say space is a non-thing in the sense that it's not something, in the sense that it's not a thing that performs a function, right? Whereas this school would say, well, space it performs the function of allowing things to arise, or allowing things to, you know, and he didn't address, so I've never seen, at one point I'll say honestly, is I've never seen any of the commentaries that said, in what sense is an analytic cessation a functioning thing? You know, you could imagine this school, so I've not seen any Lama answer that, so I'll just say, you could imagine that, like, in this school, one could assert, for example, I'm not sure, but I'll just assert my own, like more like debating now, because I never saw a definitive answer to the question. But if I were going to try to present this school, if I'm trying to think from this school's perspective, then I'll be a Vaibhashika for a second, and I'll say, well, of course of course an analytic cessation is a thing that performs a function. It performs the function of liberating you from samsara. That, you know, so those analytic cessations perform the function of granting you liberation. And of, you know, and they give rise to your state of eventually of becoming an arhat, for example.
It's a
I don't
state
know, yeah.
of being. It's a state of being. Once the cessation occurs, it's a state of being.
Right. Yep, that's right. Yeah, and so any other school, right, would say that's not a functioning thing. I think that's the only way I can think of it personally, is that this school could say, well, that serves the function of allowing you to achieve liberation or something of that sort. So therefore it is functioning. Other schools would say it's not a functioning thing, though, in the sense that it doesn't give rise to effects. You know, because if it's a negation, other schools would say if it's a negation of something, that doesn't give rise to an effect. But this school says it does, and yeah, that would be my own. If I were going to debate from this school's perspective, that's what I would say. I would say, well, wait a second, it does give rise to an effect. Your eventual arhat, achievement of the state of arhat, therefore it's a functioning thing. That would be my own debate point, but I don't know.
Well, that raises a question for me then. So when you have a cessation, is that then unchanging?
Yep. Yeah, that's unchanging. That's right.
Okay, because I was trying to make that get into line with everything is even the Buddha is always changing. Correct or wrong?
I'm pausing to try. It's easy to answer that. I've heard the answer to that many times from a Majamaka perspective. I'm trying to pause to answer, to think about the answer to it from this school's perspective. And from this school's perspective, this school would have to say, right, that the Buddha's, well, actually all the Buddhist schools would have to say that thing. So if you define the Buddha as the form body of the Buddha, right, then for sure it's a impermanent thing, right? Because the Buddha was born, the Buddha, grew up, the Buddha sat under a tree, and so on. So if you think of the form body of a Buddha and also the speech of a Buddha, then for sure those are impermanent things.
Hey, Lauren.
Yeah.
And just to add to what Paul was saying, like he was saying that cessations are, whether they're changing, but as the text says that cessations are permanent. So permanent means not changing.
Right. So that's what I was saying. Yeah. So they do not change. Sorry, was that not clear? Yeah, so they're unchanging. I thought he said they're unchanging.
Right. Right. I was just
Yeah.
saying that's kind of like what the text is saying.
Yeah. So that's where, like, so actually, so if we were going to say, is a Buddha permanent or impermanent, we'd have to say the Buddha's body is impermanent. The Buddha's speech is impermanent, but the Buddha's state of cessation is permanent. Right,
Okay.
according to this school.
Right.
Well, just out of curiosity, does this school accept the three kayas?
This school doesn't assert three kayas, actually. No, that's this school wouldn't talk about the Buddha in that way.
Okay.
This school would say the Buddha has a body, of course, right? Like, he was born and so on, and that's impermanent. The Buddha spoke. He spoke the doctrine, the Dharma. But they would say the Buddha has a cessation. That's true. So, but they don't talk in terms of three kayas. Lynn?
Okay.
I know you've explained this before, but it would help me is why are we studying the 4 different schools? I know you explained this before and I got it when you explained it and now it's gone.
Huh.
And this is what happens when something gets hard for me. I just like,
Yeah.
why are we doing this?
That's great. I think it's great to ask that, actually. So it's good. Like, I mean, there are various reasons why one might study these 4 different tenet systems, but I think the most important one is, I guess I'll say it this way, like, is that if they often say this, actually, I mean, Gelugpa teachers, particularly other schools may too, I don't know, but on this topic, is that by studying all 4 of the different tenet systems, it will help you greatly to understand the Majjhimaka. That's funny. Yeah, Cynthia's comments. And in a way, actually, Cynthia's comment is correct, right? In other words, like I said this early on, actually, like in the sense that I actually like this idea, if you want to, like, that we have to make that if you really want to understand the Majjhimaka thinking, right, you have to be willing to do what's difficult, to step into the uncomfortable, because Majjhimaka is difficult. And I'll share my own experience, actually. Like, I often think this, like, when I'll stop and when I'm studying another tenet system, and this gets harder, there'll be moments with that, if you really think deeply about the Vaibhashikas, where you'll go, how is that different from what the Majjhimikas say? You'll see it as we come to the 2 truths. And if we really get into the lack of a substantially existent self, And how is that different from what the Madhyamikas say? That's easy compared to, say, the mind-only school and the Madhyamikas. It becomes incredibly difficult to tell the difference, but they're usually different. And my point is that if you can't, this is what some scholars point out, you know, if you can't tell the difference between those levels of subtlety, then when you're thinking you're meditating on Madhyamaka, you're not, because you don't get the subtle difference. Or, you know, and that it's only by understanding a less subtle presentation that you can then really get how subtle the Madhyamaka position is. And I had that, actually I'll share that. I mean, just last night when I was yesterday evening, I was sort of, I look at the commentaries to this text, you know, each time before class. And I was looking at one, and I mean, many of the differences between the Vaibhashikas and Madhyamaka is very clear, but there was one line I read where it was talking about the lack of a substantially existent self. And just for a moment, I was like, okay, how is that different from what the Madhyamikas say? And I had to really stop and think deeply, why is that different? And again, when you get to like the mind-only school, that'll be much more difficult to differentiate. And part of it is, so one point is, if you want to actually understand the Madhyamaka position in all of its subtlety and all of its profundity, studying these other schools will help you do that. And then I'll just say a couple more points about that. And that's, in general, for meditation, that's true. And they use an analogy, some teachers use this analogy of steps. Like that each of these is like a step you know, towards realizing the view in a way. And that, you know, so the one helps you reach the next, and that helps you reach the next, and understand the details of the next. And then even, this is not the main point, but I'll add one more point. Even now, if you read Madhyamaka, the actual like ancient, especially if you read Tsongkhapa, or and then especially if you read, say, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Shantideva, Baba Viveka, and so on, these different Madhyamaka scholars, a lot of their texts also are referring back to these other tenet systems and saying they're doing actually what we're talking about. Like, so it's not just the Tibetan trip in that sense. If you read those great Indian Madhyamaka masters, what they'll say is, you know, well, you know, you may assert this. And what they're getting at, in a way, is that as we meditate, we grasp at something. And oftentimes what we'll grasp at is what these other schools assert, actually. In your meditation, you know, so they make assertions of how things exist. And what I think one thing that's true, so it's not just intellectual, in other words, but as you start meditating on emptiness in the Madhyamaka perspective, you know, and just the other night I was listening to the Dalai Lama, and he said, you know, he made a point actually where he said, he often makes this point where he was saying, you know, even Vasubandhu, you know, Chandrakirti says, even the great scholar Vasubandhu didn't understand emptiness correctly, which is like, wow, Vasubandhu was like one of the greatest Buddhist scholars of all India, right? And part of it, I guess, so what we're getting at though is like, if Vasubandhu grasped at something, we're going to grasp at things. Does that make sense? We may grasp at like a truly existent something. And to really understand, you know, what are those things we grasp at, and in what sense is that grasping? And is it grasping at a, if you haven't understood these, it's much more difficult. That's the point, I guess. So, and I guess I'll say one more just as a personal reflection on this, which is, this is just my own way of thinking sometimes. I sometimes think this, I think like, you know, if you were like going to do a retreat and you had, I don't know, I sometimes hear people get to do that. Like if you were going to do a retreat and you had like, say, a great Lama in the next room, you know, and every time you had a meditation experience, you could go next door and say, hey, I had this experience. Was that it? And they could help you fine tune it. Well, then maybe you wouldn't need to study tenets, I'm thinking. You know, you would have somebody there to correct you each time. But, you know, if we're going to meditate and we don't always have access to somebody like that, then it's very useful to understand these different subtleties of presentation, you know. And actually, I'll say one last point about this. This gets at the same, I'm saying the same thing in different ways, but there's a famous passage from the life story of Tsongkhapa himself, the historical Tsongkhapa, you know, where he had many deep meditative experiences. And then he had visions of Manjushri, right? And then he says to Manjushri, like, oh, in my meditation on emptiness, I think he asked, like, was that experience of emptiness, like, was it in accordance with the Svatantrika Majjhimaka school or a different school? This actual meditative experience. And Manjushri says, it wasn't in accordance with any school. You were off track. You weren't yet, no, it wasn't it wasn't Svatantrika Majjhimaka, it wasn't Prasangika Majjhimaka. It was something else. It was your own fabrication, basically. Go meditate more, go study more. And so how do we, he was lucky enough to have a vision of Manjushri, Manjushri tell him that. But, and even the Dalai Lama actually shared that, right? If you've listened to some of his talks, he had a beautiful scripture where he had some kind of he describes that experience where he had, like, he said it was like being struck by lightning, right? Beautiful. I mean, it was so intimate. He said he was a young person, young man, and he was meditating and studying and meditating deeply on emptiness. And he had this experience that he said was like being struck by lightning, right? And he tells the story. He went to Ling, he had what I was describing, right? He went to Ling Rinpoche. So he had the greatest Gelugpa teacher alive to go say, it was his tutor, right? And he said, hey, I had this experience. And I guess he said, Ling Rinpoche said, oh, if you keep practicing, soon you'll be a yogi of space, which means soon you'll realize the ultimate view, which was a beautiful encouragement, but also implied he hadn't yet realized the ultimate view, right? Like Ling Rinpoche was a very wonderful, great luminaries of, Buddhism. But, and who else could explain to the young Dalai Lama that he had this amazing experience, that it was a good sign along the way and that it wasn't the final view, right? And I guess as the Dalai Lama talked about, I think what he said was that the experience he'd had was in accordance with this Svatantrika Majjhimaka, not the Prasangika Majjhimaka view, that there was still a subtle grasping. And this was not some intellectualized experience, right? He said it was viscerally like being struck by lightning, that visceral experience, but it wasn't yet the Prasangika, right? And only by understanding, the Dalai Lama was able to understand the differences between the Svatantrika Majjhimaka and the Prasangika Majjhimaka. And by thinking of what Ling Rinpoche had said and then continuing to meditate, he could understand, wow, this amazing meditative experience he'd had, what was the difference? That there was still a slight subtlety difference. And so if we haven't studied these differences, then you won't know. When you have an experience, one is just intellectually, it'll be difficult to understand the text. So what I'm trying to get at is two different things. I just want to clarify. One is, if you're going to read Majjhimaka texts, if you haven't studied these things, it's going to be difficult to understand them, because there's long passages in Shantideva, for example, where Shantideva is refuting these views in his presentation of the Majjhimaka. So if you haven't understood these, you can't really understand very well what Shantideva or Chandrakirti is saying. If you read the Majjhimaka Avatara, he's refuting a lot of these views. He's often refuting Buddhist views, but so if you don't know them, then you can't understand the text. But on a deeper level, like the Dalai Lama's experience or like these other experiences, if you don't know these things, then or Tsongkhapa's experience and the Dalai Lama's, then when you have some kind of meditative experience, you won't be able to differentiate, well, what was that in accordance with? And actually, I'll share this. I'll just share another answer to your question. One day I was having lunch actually with a Buddhist friend, of mine who's a Buddhist practitioner, and he practices, he studied Tibetan tradition, he mostly practices Vipassana. And he had an experience. And he said, I was meditating the other day. We were talking, and he said, I had this experience the other day. It was like this. He was describing what happened in his meditation. And he was, meditating on Vipassana, right? And I was like, oh, wow. He was like, not quite. He was like, I was like, oh, he hadn't realized selflessness according to the Vaibhashika school, but I was like, oh, he's getting closer to what the Vaibhashikas would. I don't think he had realized selflessness yet, but he was it was like, oh, he's getting closer to what the Vaibhashikas describe as selflessness. And, and that just came about spontaneously. He doesn't study the Vaibhashika doctrine or something, but he was practicing what they practice, if that makes sense. And so he was starting to get experiences that tend in that direction. So it's like, so there are a lot of benefits, I guess is my point, whether it's for our own, so one benefit is if you're reading Majjhimaka text, it'll help you. Another is it'll help you understand if you yourself give rise to meditative experiences, what are they? And, if the Dalai Lama's experience wasn't the Prasangika, then maybe ours may not be initially the Majjhimaka Prasangika experience also. And then a third benefit is if you're trying to help other people, if you understand these different Buddhist presentations of the process of sort of progressing, then you may realize, oh, wow, this person is, you know, if you know that Tenets, you may be able to help somebody else also, right? To understand their own meditative experience and continue along their process too. You know, so there are a lot of benefits, I think, to this. If that makes sense. But does that answer? I don't know if that answers the question. But I know at times it can almost feel like you're playing like a mind game or something, right? It's like, and that, you know, and in a way, I mean, to do the work of understanding it is a little bit that, but that's not the point, if that makes sense. It's not just to play. It's not, I mean, it does build a kind of mental flexibility too, I suppose, like of being able to take different perspectives, which I think is also useful, but that's not the main point, you know, although that is good, isn't it? Yeah, I'll share. I'm sharing another reflection, just an experience. I'm just, it's sort of in reaction to what you said, but actually, I don't know, is anybody here who used to go? No. Khensa Rinpoche, he stopped now because it wasn't able to happen anymore. But for a number of years, quite a few years, he was teaching in New York City. Like he would teach for 9 days every year in New York City, and it was wonderful teachings. But and he would stay in this. There was a wonderful person who owned a brownstone in the village, and we would all stay in. Many of us would stay in that brownstone with Khensa Rinpoche. It was a very great experience, but it was kind of fun. After Rinpoche would teach in the evening, we would all sit on the stoop. There were like these big steps, and we would talk about what Rinpoche had been teaching. And I'm just sharing one more point. This is a different point, but another point about the benefits of this is sometimes we would debate, you know, and I remember watching Geshe Darge and Geshe Tashi, who are two Tibetan monks who were both raised by Khensa Rinpoche. And they would sort of participate in the debate sometimes. Sometimes it would just be non-Tibetans, non-monks, and sometimes they would join in. And one thing I was watching and I was like, wow, is like, they would take positions that were not their own every time. Like they would be so happy. Like, in other words, they would never take the Majjhimaka position because that would be too easy, you know. So they would argue from, you know, from some other school's perspective, you know, and they would try to say, well, why is Khensa Rinpoche right? You know, Khensa Rinpoche is, say, presenting a Majjhimaka view, right? And everybody, we would all go, well, of course Khensa Rinpoche is right. You know, it's Khensa Rinpoche or something. And then they would start arguing why Rinpoche is wrong, you know, from one of these other perspectives. And what really struck me was like, most of the time, I would watch, they were very humble, so they wouldn't point this out, but it was like, you know, you would leave the teaching and think, oh, you know, somebody like who's like been studying for many years, some of the people in the studio were studying this longer than me even, you know, and so you leave the teaching, you think, oh, I understood that, right? And then they're presenting a different view, and you watch and you go like, wow, I'm losing the debate, and all of us who, you know, like we can't argue why Rinpoche is right, you know, we're losing and trying to argue. And part of that is like, well, then we don't really understand, you know, it helped me realize like, well, then I don't, you know, if I can't, if in other words, if a Geshe is intentionally taking a view they know is wrong, and one time I'm watching, actually I'll just share this, one day I was watching in Tashi, who's very sweet, if you know Tashi, he's the sweetest person I know, to be honest. And like he's arguing a view that he obviously doesn't agree with, right? And he's winning. So then he starts giving the other person hints, like of how to win the debate, because he wants them to win it. You know, Tashi doesn't want to win the debate. He wants the other person to win so that they understand what Rinpoche was saying, you know. And so he's giving the other person hints and they're not seeing, and I was watching, like, they weren't getting, you know, like, he's like, you know, it's like when you watch somebody playing sports and they start throwing the ball really easy, like he was like, first he's throwing the ball hard, then he's throwing it easy, finally he's like rolling it, right? You know, it's like, but part of that is like, because and what I realized is, oh, wow, if you can't, I'm just making that point, right? I was like, wow, if I can't hold to the Majjhimaka view and somebody's debating against it, then I don't really understand it. In other words, then I'm just doing the, you know, yes, Rinpoche said that, or yes, Chandra Kirti said that, or whoever, you know, Dalai Lama said that, whoever said it, you know, Lama Zopa said it, or whatever, like, it doesn't matter who, but you get my point. Is like, so that's another, you know, it's like, I started to realize, wow, if you haven't studied these and if you can't see the difference, again, it's the same point, I'm just saying a different way, then you don't, you know, then I don't really, then the depth of understanding is not strong, you know. So there are many different, so it's understanding your own meditative experience, but it's also intellectually understanding those positions. It's also being able to read the text. There are a lot, and also helping other people. And I was watching, like, also Geshe Dargi and Tashi were helping other people, right? By taking those other views, they were helping people understand where they hadn't yet understood the subtlety of what Majjhimaka was, which the rest of us, didn't realize at that point because we hadn't thought deeply enough about it in a way, to understand, and these other schools, by arguing against the Majjhimakas, make you have to understand the subtleties of the Majjhimaka in order to really, you get my point. Anyway, I went on and on to that question. But does that make sense? I just want, I really think, because I totally get it, that at times it can seem, I remember, I'm sort of going on and on about this, but I think it's fair. Like, I remember when I used to, early on in like my being Buddhist, I remember going to the teachings by the Dalai Lama, and he would start talking about tenets, and I would be like, I don't know what he's talking, like, I would just think, this doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what he said, which of course I didn't, because I'd never studied it really systematically. How would you, so I get it, that at times it could be like, what in the world? Like, and you can see like, well, I don't really agree with that. So why would I, and like the Dalai Lama doesn't ultimately agree with, so why would you, but he was kept presenting it partly for these reasons I'm saying. In other words, like, from his own, obviously I didn't know the story at the time about his own experience of being struck by lightning experience. Like, but you start to realize he knows from experience that it's very valuable, like from an experiential perspective. But I get it that up to a certain point, in order to get to that, you have to first do some mental, it's hard work in a way to do the mental gymnastics to sort of go, well, like I was doing a few minutes ago, like, and I realized, like, I was realizing this also, like, I haven't, like some of the geshes, like, that's why I give the example of Geshe Dargi and Geshe Tashi, good friends who have studied, is they spent years, right, in the monastery doing, literally years, just studying, where their main topic of study was the Abhidharma, so they would, so they would be there for years studying that. So they have so they've thought through the implications of these things in ways, because they debate, they would debate from this perspective. So they really have it integrated. And I realized, like, I was realizing that about myself. I was like, well, I've read a lot about these topics and I've heard lamas teach about them, but I didn't spend years debating it in a monastery. So like there's a level of integration of the material, and that's why I like the questions, right? Where you go, how is an, Kelsen Avrahi's, question, right? Where you go, how can an analytic cessation be a functioning thing? That's fine. Like, in other words, to start to go, wow, I'll take that perspective, because, and then it becomes, then you have to go, and why do the Majjhimakas think it's not a functioning thing? Like, why do they think that? Those are, again, like, interesting questions. And if we don't understand why would the Majjhimakas say it's not a functioning thing, then again, right now it may seem far away, but then when you gain that realization from your Majjhimaka perspective, well, will you understand what it is? There comes a point where we need to understand that experientially, if that makes sense. So first we have to understand it intellectually, and then we can sort of, it gives us a context. You can tell I get it. I find this topic now exciting, actually, I think, because it's like, because I love that moment. I actually love having a moment where I'm like, okay, how is this different than the Majjhimaka? Because it's like that moment means I don't, like, oh wow, I just came up against something that where, like, it's not totally clear. If I had a very clear understanding of that, it wouldn't cut, then I wouldn't go, wait a second, and then I have to think through it again. And that thinking through is so helpful, isn't it? Because each time you think through it, you're getting closer to understanding the actual intent of Nagarjuna. If you go, oh, that's it, that's so useful, right? It's just like, oh, that's a difference. Oh, that's why the Majjhimakas say that. That's how it's different than this. That's very useful, actually. That's getting us closer and closer to actually understanding what Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna were getting at. But yeah, Sujata.
Lauren, I'm thinking about the order in which people who are raised up in this are taught it. I'm curious, well, I'll just take a step back. I think my own understanding, so this extremely fragile and extremely shallow cursory understanding of prasangika madhyamaka, right? And this attachment I have to this notion that like, this is the correct thing, and this is what I'm supposed to be getting. When I'm now going back and doing a deeper analysis with you, right, in this class of the things that I almost have stayed away from in order to not further confuse myself, right? Do you have some advice about how to sort of manage that emotional state as we're going through this class, right? Like, so for me, I'm catching myself trying to both hold what it is that you're teaching about this school and being like, but what's really true, right? Like, and trying to balance those. And so, like, I was noticing it earlier in this class when we're talking about like all Buddhist schools teach these two, right? The permanent and the impermanent. And I'm trying to both hold how that might apply in prasangika, right? Versus this. And that's where things are getting pretty jumbled for me. And then I'm noticing like a lot of anxiety about not wanting to walk away from, until next week. Feeling, some sort of, I'm just noticing some sort of anxiety in that, or, on one side, it's great to see what I don't know or see how fragile my understanding is. And on the other hand, maybe just in order to quiet that part of my mind, in order to just be able to hang on to what's happening in this class.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I know what you mean. I've had that experience too. Like, I think that's interesting. I get it. I'm just sort of pausing to think about it. Like, it's think of it from different angles. So I'm sort of just pausing because I'm sort of going, well, there are different ways to think about it. For me, there are different ways to think about your question that are interesting. Like, I guess the one thing I'll say sort of occurring to me is like, actually, I'll share it this way. Actually, the way I'm thinking about it is like, I'm trying to make sure I'm giving like an honest answer. That's what. I would actually want to make it a more complicated answer for a second. Like, I was going to give a simpler answer, but I want to give a more complicated one. Like, and it's related. Actually, Cynthia and I emailed about this one day. Like, I remember a few weeks ago, actually, or a month ago or something. But I remember one time I went to, this is like many, oh gosh, at least 10 years, over a decade ago. I remember I went to like a lecture by a great Kagyu Lama. And at the time I was really making a lot of effort to understand Tsongkhapa's view. And this great Kagyu Lama was like presenting a view that was not at all the same as Tsongkhapa's in terms of empty, in terms of Madhyamaka. And I just realized, I was like, oh wow, this is not the right time for me. Like, I can't, like right now, if I do this, I'm going to get totally confused. Later he became my Lama, actually, I took initiations from him and things like that, but I was like, this is not the right time. I just can't do this right now. And so I didn't continue to study, so, because I realized like it really would have at that moment, like I was not yet, I was really, really trying. I was reading like book after book, I was sort of very much engaged in like but it was like, so I can respect, like in one way it was like, wow, that was not, for me, that was a moment where I was just like it would have been too overwhelming or something. Whereas now, if I listen to his presentation, it's helpful. Like, and I'll think, oh, this is why it's different than Tsongkhapa's. This is why I agree with Tsongkhapa's on that point. But I think what he's saying is very useful and like wonderful. Even though I, like my own view is more in line with Tsongkhapa's or something, So there are times where like that can, so one is, I think sometimes there are like timing things. That's what the complexity part. But then within that, I guess I'll say like, there's this value though, isn't it? Like, if you look at, say, you know, where, again, especially with a text like this, like where it really, like trusting that for the most part, if it's, as long as it's an okay timing for us, that it will help me understand the Majjhimaka view, actually, you know, and that that's the purpose of it. And that, you know, and if you think about it this way, like that, especially a text like this one, right, that, you know, all the, like, I mean, because you're studying mostly like in Tsongkhapa's tradition, I think the Majjhimaka view is like, well, from Tsongkhapa's time down through Khyentse Rinpoche, the Dalai Lama, you know, all the lineage masters of Sera, Uganden, and Drepung studied tenets, you know, so then, you know, okay, I'm stepping into the tradition of that, and that this is what all of those, you know, like there was literally like from Tsongkhapa down through, say, Khyentse Rinpoche, everybody studied these kind of texts, you know, where they studied Panchen, you know, Sonon Dragpas, or this, you know, Jetsun Choki Geltsons, or Jamyang Shepas. They're all the same. I was actually comparing them. They all have the same structure, basically. They all present essentially the same views of each school. They've very, you know, different emphases. But so knowing like it's that it's sort of, it's leading to the same thing is another point. And then another one is like that the more, you know, like for me also, it's like, I think, I've been more able to appreciate this knowing Khyentse, like even though I've studied with other lamas, I've seen Khyentse Rinpoche do it in a way that helped me understand it, is I've really watched where he, you know, he'll step into these other schools' perspective for a moment when he's teaching something. And he can, because he's a great debater, he can really sort of, you know, when he's presenting Vaibhashika, it's Vaibhashika, you know, and he knows it so well that he can like be a Vaibhashika in a way, even though he's the best, you know, he's this incredible scholar of Majjhimaka. But it's like trusting, oh, well, that's like, I may never reach, I'm sure I'll never be like Khyentse Rinpoche in that way. You know, he's done this his whole life, but knowing like, wow, to the extent that we can do that, it's going to help is another point. And then I guess, and then the last thing I'll say, and this is more the psychologist in me answer for a second, is like, but it helps me, so that's why I'm sharing it. I'm not sharing it to be your therapist. I'm sharing it because it helps me understand something. Is I sometimes think of it in terms of the brain for myself. Like, in other words, like the more times I do the repetitions of going through different lines of reasoning and understanding Majjhimaka philosophy, it's laying down neuronal connections, you know, in my brain. And that one thing that's interesting is like laying down other connections of Buddhist philosophy aren't going to undermine those. They're not going to decrease those. Those are still there. Like, in other words, whatever connections, or however much time I'm going to spend focusing on Majjhimaka is going to create, you know, that much based on neuroplasticity, it's going to create that many connections for understanding that. And if I spend time studying these other schools, it's not going to decrease those. You know, it's going to give like another set of understandings, which eventually those will combine. And often as what we're at the point of is like where we've got these, which are kind of like you're describing, a little fragile, then we've got another one which is even more fragile. And so we can't yet easily, you know, but it's like, I think that's the model actually in this, if you look at someone like Khyentse Rinpoche, is like, you know, you sort of, if you keep laying down each of those, there comes a point where you can then, that's what Geshe Tashi was doing on the stoop or so, right? It's like, you can then play with them together. And once you can play with them, then your understanding of Majjhimaka gets much deeper. You know, and so knowing it's like, at the beginning, you can't really interact them too well because it's like, I don't know, it's like, you know, whatever, you know, it's still too new or something. It's like trying to, I remember like, you know, like a little, I'm trying to think of an analogy that's physical. Like, you know, I remember when I was a little boy and trying to learn sport, you know, you can't do, it's like if you're trying to dribble the ball, you can't shoot. And if you're trying to shoot, you can't dribble because, you know, but if you practice both, eventually you're able to dribble and then shoot or something. It's like that, you know, and that it's like, that's neuronal, really. It's like our brain is learning and body is learning to do it. I think it's similar here. So like, let yourself do the one, let yourself do the other. You know, don't even worry too much, I think, at the beginning about, can I do them simultaneously or something like that? And you're going to do that some, but like trusting that the other will still be there in your mind, you know, and then if you do this too, eventually there'll come a point where you can play them together, and that's going to help your understanding of Majjhimaka a lot, is the idea. Does that make sense, kind of?
Yes, thank you. Super helpful.
Good. Hope it's okay. I added the brain perspective. I don't know if that was useful, but
Super useful.
that's not according to any of the tenet systems, I suppose. It's a different tenet school. But any other questions, actually? Because we did, I mean, I think it's good that people are asking questions. And we just have a few minutes left. So. Well, maybe I'll just say, so I'll just make a couple final comments before we stop. So so that was the section, right? So I just want to summarize again. So we're in the section on the way of asserting objects, right? And so the first way of asserting objects was permanent and impermanent, right? That's one way of categorizing all existent phenomena. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I just want to mention. So the next categorization is particularly an important one, right? It's going to be, in some ways, maybe, you know, and actually, I think that's true in a way. Like, in a way, the next categorization is the most important, I'll even say, in terms of our understanding. And so I'll just read the two lines, right? I'll read I'll just read one little piece here, which says, another way of dividing things, right? So things means existent phenomena, right? As we've said. So another way of dividing things is into conventional truths and ultimate truths. And so that's what we're going to cover next class, really, is go into detail about conventional truths and ultimate truths in this system, which are, in a way, yeah, I do think it's fair to say, is probably the most important topic in this Vaibhashika. That and the way of asserting selflessness might be the most important topics in this. Those two go together, and in this section of the book, of this text, and again, I just want to emphasize this point because it's where I started today. Is right. So every school actually is going to present conventional and ultimate. Does that make sense, right? Like, in other words, all the different schools are going to present conventional truth and ultimate truth, and in each case, it's going to be a different presentation. Does that make sense? Each of these schools is going to say something at least slightly different about what is a conventional truth and what is an ultimate truth. And one thing I guess that's interesting is, and I'll just point this out to prepare you for next class, right? In the higher schools, right, like in Madhyamaka, and even in some of the parts of of mind only, we're used to ultimate truths being a negation, right? In other words, the ultimate truth is the lack of inherent existence, right? Or the lack of true existence, right? Something like that. Whereas I just want to point this out as a kind of a, I don't know, warm up or something for next class, is in this school, ultimate truths are not a negation. There's something, ultimate truths are substantially existent and ultimately existent things, actually, right? So that's different. Does that make sense? That's a big difference, actually. And part of this school's position is, you can imagine, actually, I just want to say that, I think you can imagine it, right? Like, just in terms of avoiding nihilism, which is where I started, from this school's perspective, if you were to say the ultimate truth is something, is a negation, they would say, well, then if the ultimate is negation, then then nothing exists, right? This school says there has to be some basis for things. If we're not going to be nihilists, we have to say there's some ultimate basis. Does that make sense? In order to avoid nihilism, we have to say there's some ultimate basis for phenomena. And so otherwise, you're falling into nihilism. And so this school is going to say, again, it's radical, right? This school this school in a way is amazing, right? Because it's upholding the Buddha's view of selflessness, right? That there is, the Buddha was incredible. Maybe I'll end with that, right? The Buddha was an unbelievably radical person, right? In asserting, what an amazing thing, right? He's the only person, right? The only spiritual, like, it's the only tradition, it's a unique tenet of Buddhism, right? We said the four basic, what do you call those? The four seals of Buddhism, right? And one of those 4 seals is all things are empty and are selfless and empty, right? That's a totally unique Buddhist position, right? The Buddha was incredibly radical. I mean, imagine that. The Buddha's radical insight was the most fun. It was the opposite of Descartes, right? Like Descartes, right? Descartes sat there and said, you know, I think, therefore I am. If there's one thing I can know, it's that I exist, right? And the Buddha said, no, you're wrong. You don't. That, you know, that's an incorrect. I mean, that's unbelievably radical, right? And so this school is the least subtle in one way, but it's amazingly subtle, right? It's saying, how do I cope with the Buddha's incredible assertion that of selflessness while still saying things exist? You know, and that's what I'm getting is that's the question of conventional and ultimate truth, right? How do you say that something, how do you undermine or negate self, right, as a fundamental basis, right? Because Descartes, right, he was saying something, you know, how do I know anything exists? Well, I exist, right? And the Buddha is saying, no, you don't exist. That's not the fundamental basis, right? So what's true then, right? It's radically disorienting. So if you were already disoriented earlier, you know, no, it's like the Buddha's assertion is incredibly disorienting, right? He's saying the most fundamental thing that you think exists, which is you, is not the basis of reality, right? So this school is coping with that and saying, so how do I still assert that something exists, right? How do I uphold the Buddha's assertion of selflessness while still saying phenomena function? And that's their emphasis on function, right? Things function, right? This school is really concerned with that. And it's great that it's concerned with that, right? Because it doesn't want to produce a bunch of nihilists who go around destroying the environment, right? And ruining the planet and hurting each other, you know, that can achieve the Buddha's insight while still staying within the realm of ethics and care for each other. So I think it's an amazing system. You know, I just wanted to say that. So this thing about conventional ultimate, again, it could seem like, oh, conventional truth, ultimate truth. But these are actually, all the schools present that. And this school is doing something amazing, which is trying to cope with the Buddha's assertion of selflessness while still asserting phenomena and functionality. And we're going to get into how do they do that with conventional and ultimate next time. All right, so let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel, Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And actually, I want to say one more thing before we stop, just about a schedule, just something about the schedule that I want to point out. And the thing is, so next week we have class, you know, where we'll get into the conventional ultimate truth. And then I need to post the class. I'll send Gabe soon the classes. I just realized I didn't send them yet, I don't think, for March. So I'll send them soon. But I wanted to point out that I will schedule some classes in March. But also, one thing that I'm considering this part of this class, it's going to be an unusual event. So I just want to, it's on the website, but I didn't list it as part of the class, but I want to mention it, is March 13th, instead of a regular class, we're going to have something unique, which is a unique event in a way, which is, it's connected to tenets, but I'm hoping it's going to be an example of what I was talking about earlier about this cognitive flexibility and sort of playing with these things. Is a friend of mine who's a master of Chan Buddhism named Guagu. He's a Chan master. Chan is the Chinese tradition of Buddhism that eventually was sent. Many people in America know it as Zen tradition of Tibet. Of Japan. It was derived from the Chan tradition of China. So he's a master of the Chan tradition. And so what we're going to talk about is he wrote a book recently on Shiken Taza, which is the title of the book is Silent Illumination. That means silent illumination. So it's a particular Chan meditation. And what he and I agreed to do is have a dialogue where we compare Chan meditation and Mahamudra. So the Tibetan tradition of Mahamudra and the Chan tradition of silent illumination. I'm reading his book now about that Chan tradition. But the reason why I wanted to do it on a Saturday at this time is what I want to ask you guys to do, if you're willing, is to listen to it from a Tenets perspective. like, I'll be curious. I'm starting to figure it out myself right now by reading his book. Is, you know, so is Sean presenting Madhyamaka, or is it presenting some other, you know, is it presenting what Buddhist school is his presentation from? Is a question I would raise. I mean, that'd be a question I would raise to you guys. And that's what Tashi and Geshe Dargya were trying to play with, if that makes sense, you know. And what I want to encourage you guys is to start playing with it. I actually am wondering about this. I don't know. I don't want to make this class too complicated. I mean, we're mostly going to do the text. But I started thinking about like asking friends who practice in the Vipassana tradition to do that or something. You know, I don't know. It would be interesting. I'm still not sure if we want to do that. But part of it is like, can we do that? Can we study Buddhist tenets and then start to see, well, can you recognize, right? When somebody's talking about Buddhism, you know, if you read a text, what tenet is it from, right? If you talk to a teacher, if you talk to somebody who's practicing a particular tradition of Buddhism, what tenet system is it? Are they coming at it from? And we may not be perfect at that, but I want to suggest playing at that is part of is part of benefiting from this and part of integrating it. And so I wanted to say, I scheduled that event on a Saturday thinking that might be a fun way to sort of, so after that, I mean, we'll just, with him, I'll just have the dialogue, but then the next class, I want to bring it up and ask you guys, well, what do you think? What tenet, you know, can we see anything about what tenet that is? And then we can come back to it later too. And maybe we'll ask a couple of other, I might do that, even ask one or two other teachers from Buddhist other traditions, just as, even if they share for 20 minutes or something, with the idea being to start exploring this question of tenets in a more embodied way. That's what, you know, so it's not purely some distant intellectualized question, but a question of practice. Does that make sense? So that's why I'm kind of intrigued by that idea. And I think that would be fun, actually, maybe to ask at least like a Vipassana person, or, and then maybe somebody else. I don't know, we'll see. That'd be fun, actually. Maybe I'll ask somebody from a mind-only perspective too, or something. So anyway, just that. But I'll send the rest of the schedule for March in the next week. But thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
Good to see y'all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lauren. Bye.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.